She was left to die in the snow, her husband's footsteps fading into the storm. But when a Cherokee warrior found her half-frozen body, he didn't just save her life, he gave her a reason to live again. The wind cut through her like broken glass, tearing the last warmth from her skin. The world had gone white, a place without sound or mercy, and Evelyn Hart stumbled through it like a ghost that refused to die. Her shoes were gone, lost somewhere on the trail when the leather froze stiff and cracked apart. She had tried to wrap her feet in strips of her skirt, but the cloth had frozen to the skin, and now every step left small streaks of blood on the snow. The storm had swallowed the mountains, the sky, the sun itself. It was all one endless blur of white that hid the road and erased her past. She could not remember the sound of her husband's voice anymore, only the sharp crack of the whip when he struck the mule and the bitterness in his eyes when the wagon toppled. He had blamed her for the wreck, said she had cursed them, then taken the rifle and walked away without looking back. She had waited in the wreckage for 2 days, whispering that he would return, but when the snow began to bury the wheels, she had known he never would. She tried to think of warmth, of a hearth somewhere, of bread baking and coffee boiling, but even her memory seemed cold now. Her hands had gone blue, her lips cracked and bleeding, her hair stiff with ice. She spoke aloud to no one, a slow murmuring that mixed prayer with madness. "Just 1 more mile," she said, though she did not know where the mile began or ended. A crow passed overhead, black against the storm, and for a moment she thought it was death itself coming to take her. She almost smiled at the thought. By the time she reached the creek, the wind had eased, but her body no longer obeyed her. She dropped to her knees, her breath a thin cloud in the frozen air. The water beneath the ice moved faintly, dark and slow, and she thought how beautiful it looked, a ribbon of life under all that cold. She pressed her palm against it, but the ice burned like fire, and she pulled back with a cry that was more animal than human. The sound faded into the wind. She crawled to a fallen pine and tried to gather the snow into her mouth, but her jaw would not move. Her eyes closed without meaning to. She felt herself falling, not through space but into silence, the kind that hums behind the ears just before the end. She thought of her mother's voice, soft and far away, saying her name like a lullaby. She whispered back, "I'm sorry," though she did not know to whom. The snow began to cover her skirt, the white creeping higher, until she was only a shape against the drift. Her last thought before darkness came was that maybe this was mercy, to be held by the earth, to be forgotten, to rest at last in the quiet of the storm. The forest groaned beneath the weight of the storm, branches bending low under snow that seemed to fall without end. Atsadi moved through it like a shadow, his breath steady, his fur-lined cloak drawn close around his shoulders. He had hunted since dawn, following the faint tracks of a deer that had long vanished, yet he did not turn back. There was a feeling in the air, something restless that pulled him deeper into the white silence. The wind carried only the sound of his steps and the faint crack of trees splitting under frost. When he reached the creek, he stopped. At first, he thought it was a fallen bundle of rags tangled near the ice, some settler's waste caught by the storm. Then he saw the hand, pale as ash, fingers stiff but still curved toward life. He knelt beside her and brushed the snow away. Her face was hollow, lips split, lashes frozen together like threads of glass. She looked half made of ice, yet when he pressed his fingers to her throat, he felt the slow flutter of a pulse. A faint sound escaped her, not a word, only breath struggling to exist. Atsadi's jaw tightened. He could have left her. The storm was cruel, and mercy could cost him his own life. But his mother's voice came to him, a whisper from years gone. All who breathe are kin until they cease. He lifted her gently, surprised by how light she was, as if the storm had already begun to carry her away. The snow rose to his knees as he walked. each step a battle against wind that clawed and howled around them. He adjusted her weight across his chest, wrapping his cloak around both their bodies, and kept his eyes on the black line of trees ahead. Time dissolved into motion, breath, and snow. Once, he stumbled, nearly dropping her, and her head fell against his shoulder, a faint warmth touching his neck. It startled him more than the cold ever could. The cabin waited by the river, hidden between pine and rock. Smoke from the morning fire still drifted faintly from its chimney, a thin promise of warmth. He kicked the door open with his boot, carried her inside, and laid her near the hearth. The room was dim and close, filled with the scent of dried sage and pine resin. He moved quickly, feeding the fire, stripping off his wet cloak, wrapping her in the bearskin that hung beside the bed. Her eyes fluttered open once, unfocused, and she made a small sound, a word lost to delirium. Atsadi poured water into a tin cup, warmed it by the fire, and touched it to her lips. She didn't drink, but he saw her throat move, and that was enough. Outside, the wind roared louder, but the snow began to fill the tracks leading to his door. By the time darkness came, not a single footprint remained. The world had hidden them both, as if it had chosen to let the dead rest and the living begin again. The first thing Evelyn felt was heat. Not gentle warmth, but the heavy kind that pressed against her skin until it hurt. She opened her eyes to see a roof made of rough timbers and a fire snapping close by. For a moment she thought she had died and woken in some place between heaven and earth. The light flickered across the walls, and shadows moved like quiet watchers. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw, her body wrapped in something soft that smelled of smoke and fur. When she tried to move, pain flared through her legs, sharp and bright, and she gasped. A shape appeared beside her, tall and silent, eyes dark as river stones. The man crouched, stirring a small pot that hung above the flames, and then dipped a wooden spoon, holding it toward her mouth. She stared at him, afraid to breathe. He spoke, but his words were slow, careful, a mix of English and another tongue she didn't know. "Eat," he said, his voice deep and calm, like the sound of water moving under ice. She wanted to refuse, to clutch the blanket tighter and vanish back into her fever, but the smell of broth broke her will. He guided the spoon to her lips, and the first sip made her tremble. Salt, fat, warmth. She swallowed greedily, tears rising without reason. When she coughed, he waited, saying nothing, then gave her another spoonful. Hours passed like that, marked by the rhythm of the fire and the slow turning of his hands. He wrapped her feet in clean cloth, soaked in something that burned at first but eased the ache after. She winced when he touched her, expecting anger, expecting the quick sting of punishment, but none came. His touch was steady, efficient, never cruel. When she tried to thank him, her voice broke halfway through, and he only nodded, eyes unreadable. She studied him in the shifting firelight. His hair was long, braided down his back, his face calm but hard in its lines. A scar crossed one cheek, old and pale, and his hands bore the marks of labor and battle. He moved with the quiet of someone used to solitude, every motion deliberate. She had known men who shouted to fill silence, who struck when they feared being small, but this man seemed to draw strength from stillness itself. When she drifted in and out of sleep, she saw flashes of memory. The wagon turned on its side, her husband's boots walking away, the endless white swallowing everything she had left. Each time she woke, the same sound greeted her, the crack of fire, the breath of a stranger keeping watch. On the third night, she opened her eyes and found him sitting across from her, sharpening a knife. The light caught the edge of the blade, bright as snow. He looked up and met her gaze. There was no pity in him, only quiet measure, as if he weighed her will against the storm still lingering in her eyes. And in that silence she realized he wasn't asking if she would live. He was waiting to see if she wanted to. When the fever finally broke, it left Evelyn weak as a child. Sweat soaked the blanket around her, and her breath came slow, but her mind was clear for the first time in days. The fire still burned, smaller now, the smoke curling up through a narrow hole in the roof. She turned her head and saw Atsadi kneeling by the hearth, his back to her, his shirt loose at the shoulder where the fabric had torn. In the thin light she saw the scars, thick lines of old burns crossing his skin, and near his collarbone the faint circle of a branding iron, the mark of cruelty pressed deep and long ago. She stared until shame filled her, but he didn't turn. He was cleaning his knife, moving with the same slow care he used for everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "You should drink." He filled a cup and held it to her lips, the steam warming her face. His hands were rough, the skin dark and lined with old wounds, yet his grip was gentle. She drank, the water cool against her tongue. When she had finished, she looked at him and whispered, "Why did you save me?" He met her eyes for the first time. Something passed between them then, a flicker of memory too painful to name. His gaze didn't waver. "Because no one saved my wife." The words struck harder than any wind. Evelyn opened her mouth but found nothing to say. He turned back to the fire, adding another log, his movements heavy with thought. The flames caught, light flickering across his face, showing lines of exhaustion carved deep into his features. She wanted to ask what had happened, who she was, but something in his silence told her the story was buried too deep for words. Outside, the storm had eased, but the world remained white and endless. She could hear the river under its skin of ice, the soft groan of trees shifting in the cold. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and pine resin, of herbs drying on a line above the bed. Atsadi reached for a wooden bowl, stirred something thick and fragrant, and handed it to her. "Eat," he said again, and this time she obeyed without hesitation. When she finished, she leaned back, her eyes tracing the patterns carved into the cabin walls, marks of animals, rivers, and stars. She wondered if they were prayers or memories. He sat across from her, the knife now resting beside him, and for a long while they said nothing. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with its steady rhythm. Evelyn felt the weight of his answer settle into her heart. He hadn't saved her out of duty or desire, but because some old grief still guided his mercy. She looked at his scarred shoulder, at the calm strength in his face, and whispered, "I'm sorry." He shook his head once. "Don't be." The storm took enough already. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was the kind that binds two broken souls who no longer owe the world anything but truth. By the time her legs were strong enough to carry her, the days had begun to lengthen. The snow outside the cabin still reached the window ledge, but the air felt softer when she breathed it in. Evelyn stood at the doorway wrapped in a borrowed coat, her hands trembling as she fastened the buttons. Atsadi was out near the river checking his traps, and the silence inside the cabin pressed on her like a weight. She told herself she was grateful that he had saved her life, but gratitude was not the same as belonging. She stared at the wide white world and whispered, "I don't belong here." The words sounded smaller than she expected. She stepped into the cold, the wind biting through the seams of her coat, snow crunching beneath her boots. Each step took her further from the warmth of the fire, further from the man whose quiet steadiness both comforted and frightened her. She followed the narrow path that led upward toward the ridge. The sky was pale and endless, the kind of blue that made the land feel hollow. Halfway up, her breath began to burn in her throat. The snow was deeper there, crusted hard with ice, and her foot slipped, sending her to her knees. The cold hit her like a slap. For a moment she stayed there, gasping, watching her breath vanish in thin clouds. Then she heard it, his voice, calm and clear, behind her. "The snow don't care what you believe." She turned and saw him standing below, fur hood drawn tight, bow slung across his back. He didn't move toward her, only waited, his face unreadable. The truth in his words stung more than the wind. She pushed herself up, took 2 steps, then stopped. The world beyond the ridge looked endless and empty. A grave dressed in white. Shame crawled through her chest as she turned back. Atsadi said nothing as she passed him, only followed her down the slope, his shadow stretching beside hers across the snow. Inside the cabin, she stripped off her coat and sat by the fire, shaking. He set a pot over the flames and poured her tea made from pine needles, the steam carrying a sharp, clean scent. She drank without speaking. When he handed her a piece of dried meat, she took it and chewed slowly, the salt reminding her of life. Something in her broke then, quiet but deep, the last piece of pride that had kept her apart. The next morning she rose before him and swept the floor, gathered the woodpile, and set traps near the creek. She mended a torn fur with clumsy stitches and hung herbs to dry above the fire. Every act, small as it was, felt like an offering. When Atsadi returned, he glanced at her work and nodded once. No words were needed. That night the light from the fire spread across the room, soft and steady, and for the first time since the storm, Evelyn felt she had earned her place inside it. The days began to blend, the sharp white of winter softening into shades of gray and blue. Smoke rose from the chimney each morning, marking the cabin like a heartbeat in the cold. Evelyn woke to the sound of the river beneath its crust of ice, steady and alive, and to the soft rhythm of Atsadi's movements. He was always awake before her, tending the fire, checking the traps, returning with snow on his shoulders and a quiet nod that meant the world was still turning. She no longer flinched at the sound of his steps or the scrape of his knife against wood. Instead, she found comfort in their steadiness, the way every small sound had begun to belong. One morning as she mixed cornmeal into a pot, he sat across from her and pointed to the flames. "Atsila," he said, his voice slow, his finger tapping the air between them. She repeated it, and he nodded. But when he pointed toward the frozen river outside and said, "Atsi," she stumbled over the sound. He laughed softly, the sound low and warm, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Fire," she said again, pointing to the water, and he shook his head, amusement in his eyes. "No, that one burns you. This one saves you," he said, and the way he smiled made her laugh for the first time in months. Later she asked what his own name meant, and he hesitated before answering. "Atsadi," he said, touching his chest, "means fish. My mother say it means patience." He smiled a little then, eyes half lost to memory. "She say I wait too long for everything." Evelyn looked at him, at the calm in his face, and said, "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." He met her gaze, and for a moment the silence between them felt full, not empty. The days found their pattern after that. She cooked while he carved, they ate together by the fire, and the quiet grew soft instead of sharp. Sometimes he spoke words in his language and waited for her to try them, laughing when she failed, but never mocking. She began to recognize the rhythm of his world, the way he listened before speaking, the way his eyes followed the sky, as if reading messages she could not see. She learned how to mend traps and skin rabbits, how to braid rope from strips of bark, how to read the direction of the wind by the way the smoke tilted from the chimney. At night she would sit by the fire and watch him work, his hands steady, the knife glinting in the light. She wanted to ask about his wife, about the pain behind his eyes, but something held her back. Some stories, she had learned, were sacred because they were still bleeding. When he caught her watching, he would say a word in Cherokee she didn't yet know, his tone soft and teasing, and she would answer with one of her own, half mispronounced, and he would laugh again. In that laughter, gentle and rare, she found her first taste of peace. The dream came heavy and sharp, dragging her back to a place she thought she had buried under snow. In it she was standing beside the wagon again, her husband's voice thick with whiskey, his hand gripping her arm so hard she could feel the bruises even in sleep. He called her the same name he always did when the world turned against him, said she was a burden too light to love, something he had to carry only because no one else would. His words hit harder than his fists ever did, slicing through the thin shield she had built around her heart. The storm howled around them, the lantern swinging wild, and when he pushed her into the snow, she heard herself scream his name, but not from fear, from the desperate need to be seen one last time before he left her. She woke with a cry, her throat dry, her body tangled in the blanket. The fire had burned low, its glow faint and trembling against the walls. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to breathe past the ache in her chest. The door creaked, and Atsadi stepped in, carrying a bundle of wood. He set it down without a word, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. She expected him to ask what was wrong, to tell her it was only a dream, but he didn't. He moved to the hearth, stirred the coals, and fed them new life until the flames caught again. Then he sat beside the fire, cross-legged, silent, his face calm but not distant. Evelyn pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her breath uneven. She wanted to speak, to explain, but her voice refused her. The quiet stretched, not cold but waiting. The fire popped, sending a small spark onto the floor. Atsadi reached for it without looking, pressed it back into the flame with the tip of a stick, and kept watching the embers. She listened to the sound of the river under the ice outside, a slow rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Bit by bit, her breathing eased. The dream loosened its grip, slipping back into the dark where it belonged. When her eyes grew heavy again, he stood, checked the door, and said softly, "Sleep now." It wasn't a command, only a promise that the night would hold. She lay back, the warmth of the fire brushing her skin, and drifted into a quieter sleep. Dawn came pale and still. Light filtered through the small window, falling across the bed like a blessing. Evelyn stirred and felt something beneath her hand, small and rough. She lifted it and saw a charm made from cedar twigs woven into a circle, bound by a strip of red thread. It smelled faintly of smoke and pine. She turned it in her fingers, wondering when he had made it. On one side, a single feather was tied with care. She looked toward the fire where Atsadi was brewing tea and whispered a thank you he didn't need to hear. The charm said everything already. The morning began like any other, quiet and still, the air brittle with cold. Smoke curled from the chimney and drifted low over the river, the sound of water faint beneath its frozen shell. Evelyn was gathering wood when she saw Atsadi kneeling near the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the snow. His body was tense, shoulders drawn tight beneath his fur coat. She walked closer, careful not to startle him, and saw the prints he traced with his gloved hand. They wound through the trees and vanished into the brush, deep and sharp. He said nothing for a long while, then murmured, "Not deer, not elk." She frowned, staring at the marks. "Wolves?" she asked, but he shook his head slowly. "Maybe, maybe not." The uncertainty in his tone chilled her more than the wind. He rose and went to the cabin. Taking down his rifle from the wall, he checked the chamber, his movements slow and deliberate, then slung a pouch of powder across his chest. "Stay here," he said. She nodded, but something in her chest twisted. The cabin felt smaller the moment he stepped outside, its warmth too fragile to trust. She tried to keep busy, feeding the fire, sweeping the floor, but every gust of wind made her flinch. When she heard the faint crack of a branch in the distance, her heart leapt. She told herself to wait. She lasted only minutes. Pulling her coat tight, she followed the trail he had taken, her boots crunching softly in the snow. The forest pressed close around her, the pines heavy with frost, their shadows long and dark. She caught glimpses of his tracks ahead, steady and sure, and hurried to keep them in sight. When she reached the ridge, she saw him below, crouched near a line of snares. Something had disturbed them, tearing through the bait and scattering the traps. A shape moved between the trees, quick and low. Evelyn's breath caught. Atsadi lifted his rifle, eyes narrow, scanning the shadows. Then came a sound, not the growl of a wolf, but the hiss of a man's curse. Two figures rose from the brush, ragged and thin, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces hollow with hunger. Scavengers. Settlers gone feral after a winter too long. One sneered, stepping forward. Didn't know this was Cherokee land, he said, voice brittle with cold. Atsadi didn't answer, only aimed the rifle, calm as the snow itself. The men hesitated, muttered something under their breath, and began to back away. Evelyn stepped from the trees without thinking, her pulse hammering. The movement drew their eyes, but she stood her ground, trembling yet unflinching. When the men vanished into the woods, the silence that followed rang loud in her ears. Atsadi lowered his rifle and turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I told you stay," he said quietly. She met his gaze, voice shaking but firm. "I couldn't." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Together they gathered the broken snares, their hands brushing now and then, the fear between them giving way to something steadier, something that felt almost like trust. The night was quiet except for the sound of the fire and the faint rush of the river beneath its frozen skin. The air inside the cabin smelled of rabbit stew and pine smoke, warm and sharp all at once. Evelyn sat cross-legged on the floor, the bowl in her hand sending small curls of steam toward her face. Atsadi sat across from her, his back straight, the shadows of the flames moving across his features. They ate in silence, the kind of silence that no longer felt heavy, but real, like the breath between heartbeats. When she finished, she set her bowl aside and waited, sensing something in him restless and near the surface. He stirred the coals with a stick, the glow catching the scar on his cheek. Then he spoke, his voice low and even, the words measured as if pulled from a place long sealed. "When I was young, soldiers came," he said. "They burned our homes, said we had to go east or die. My mother tried to hide me in the river reeds, but the fire found her. I fought after that, with others. We tried to take back what was gone." He paused, his gaze lost in the flame. "I thought if I killed enough of them, the land would remember me. But war only remembers death." He looked up then, eyes dark but steady. "When the fighting ended, I walked back to where my village had been. There was nothing left. The snow had covered everything, and I thought maybe it was better that way." Evelyn didn't speak. Her throat ached with the effort of keeping her tears quiet. The fire snapped, a piece of wood collapsing into embers. Atsadi's face softened, though his voice did not waver. "My wife died before that winter. Fever. No one to bury her but me." His hands tightened on his knees, the knuckles pale. "I made a promise to the ground that day. I said I would never turn away another who was lost. Maybe that is why I found you." The words settled between them like falling ash. Evelyn leaned closer to the fire, the heat bright against her skin, and whispered, "Then maybe we were both buried by the same storm." Her voice broke on the last word, but she didn't look away. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his gaze shifted toward her, the lines around his mouth softening. In that look was something she had never seen before in any man's eyes. Not pity, not hunger, but peace, small and fragile as the first thaw of spring. He reached for the pot, poured the last of the stew into her bowl, and pushed it toward her. "Eat," he said quietly. "The night is long." She smiled faintly, wiping at her eyes, and obeyed. The wind outside pressed against the walls, but inside the cabin the warmth held steady, and in its glow, two people who had survived different kinds of fire learned that sometimes healing begins not in words, but in the silence that follows them. The sound of horses reached them before the figures appeared, faint at first, like echoes carried through the pines. Evelyn looked up from the water she was heating and felt her stomach twist. Atsadi was outside, splitting wood, and when he heard it too, he froze mid-swing. The air changed, still and sharp. He set the axe down and looked toward the trail. Moments later, the riders came into view. 5 men wrapped in heavy coats, rifles across their saddles. Snow clung to their beards, their breath rising in white clouds. Evelyn's heart began to pound. One of them was a face she knew, her husband's brother, James. The sight of him dragged up everything she had tried to bury, the shouting, the fists, the night she was left for dead. The men dismounted near the fence. The tallest one, James, called out, "We're looking for a missing woman. Pale hair, about your height." His eyes moved over her with a slow, cruel familiarity. "Wouldn't be you, would it?" Evelyn swallowed hard, unable to speak. Atsadi stepped forward then, his stance calm but alert. The men's attention shifted to him, their expressions tightening. One muttered under his breath, "Savage." Another spat into the snow. Atsadi said nothing, only watched them, his hand resting near his rifle, but not on it. James sneered, taking a step closer. "You hiding her here?" he asked, his tone sharp. Evelyn found her voice at last. "I'm the one you're looking for," she said, and the silence that followed was heavy as stone. The men stared, confusion turning to disgust. "You?" James laughed, short and bitter. "God Almighty, you've lost your mind. You're coming home." She shook her head. "There is no home." The youngest of the group shifted uncomfortably. "She don't look taken," he muttered. But James ignored him. "You've been stolen, Eve. Look at you, living like some heathen woman." His words were knives meant to shame. Evelyn felt the sting of them but did not move. Atsadi's voice broke the air then, quiet but firm. "She stays where she wants." The way he said it made the men bristle. James's hand went to his rifle. "Don't you speak to me," he snapped. "You think she's yours? She's a white woman." The tension was a living thing now, sharp enough to taste. Evelyn stepped between them, her body trembling but her eyes clear. "Stop," she said, her voice steady. "He saved me when your brother left me to die." The words hung in the cold. For a moment no one spoke. Then James said softly, "You're sick. You don't know what you're saying." Atsadi didn't look away from the men, but his hand eased from the rifle. He knew killing them would only chain her to grief again. Evelyn turned to James. "I'm not going back," she said, and her voice carried more strength than she knew she had. The men shifted, uncertain. Finally James spat in the snow and turned toward his horse. "You'll regret this," he said. When they rode off, their tracks cut deep into the white. But the air felt lighter. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her breath trembling, and realized she had chosen. They came back at dawn, their horses snorting steam into the cold air, their boots crunching through the crusted snow. Evelyn had known they would. The night before, she had barely slept, lying beside the fire, listening to the wind and the slow rhythm of Atsadi's breathing. When the sound of hooves reached the cabin, she rose, her stomach knotted but her hands steady. Atsadi was already at the door, his rifle leaning against the frame. He met her eyes, a silent question there, and she shook her head. "No blood," she whispered. He nodded once, though she saw the flicker of tension in his jaw. The men dismounted without a word, their faces hard with anger and cold. James was first, his coat half open, his eyes burning with something that looked more like shame than fury. "You're coming with us," he said. "I tried to be kind yesterday, but this ain't right. You're not staying here with him." He reached for her arm, but she stepped back, her boots sinking into the snow. "Don't," she said, her voice low. He laughed, bitter and cruel. "Don't what? You think you got a choice now? You're a married woman, not some savage's plaything." The others shifted behind him, uneasy, glancing at Atsadi, who stood silent near the cabin wall. His rifle remained untouched, but his stance carried the weight of calm danger. Evelyn could feel the air tightening, each breath colder than the last. James lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. His grip was iron, and the shock of it sent her heart into her throat. She twisted hard, breaking free, stumbling into the open space between them and Atsadi. Her pulse thundered, but her voice, when it came, was steady, rough as stone. "He saved me when your kind left me to die." For a moment, everything stopped. The words hung in the air, raw and final. James's face darkened. He spat into the snow, the sound sharp in the silence. "You're lost," he said. "Filthy and lost." He turned his glare to Atsadi. "You think she's yours? You'll get what's coming. Folks, don't forget." Atsadi took a single step forward, his hand hovering near his rifle, but Evelyn reached back and touched his arm. "Don't fight," she said quietly. "I've already chosen." Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not. She stood straight, the wind pulling strands of her hair loose, her breath clouding between them. The men stared, uncertain, as if seeing her for the first time. The youngest one muttered something under his breath, a curse or a prayer, then turned his horse. The others followed, their anger leaking away like smoke in the cold. James lingered a moment longer, his pride too heavy to swallow, then swung into the saddle. "You'll regret it," he said again, but his voice carried no strength. They rode off, their figures shrinking into the gray horizon. Evelyn stayed where she was until the sound faded. The snow fell softly now, thin and endless, covering their tracks almost as quickly as they formed. Atsadi stepped beside her, saying nothing, and together they watched the white world close around them, unafraid. Spring came slow to the mountains, creeping in quiet as a breath after long silence. The snow thinned first along the river, melting into water that ran fast and brown, carrying twigs and memory downstream. Patches of earth began to show through the drifts, black and rich and full of promise. Evelyn woke one morning to the sound of dripping from the eaves, and for the first time since the storm that had nearly claimed her, the world smelled of life again. She stepped outside, bare feet sinking into cold mud, and laughed softly to herself. Atsadi stood by the woodpile, watching the light climb through the trees. He nodded when she caught his eye, and though he said nothing, she saw the same quiet relief written in his face. They worked side by side through the days that followed, repairing what the winter had broken. The roof sagged where the snow had pressed too heavy, and together they lifted new beams, their hands raw but steady. Evelyn mixed mud and straw for the chinks, humming an old tune she barely remembered, and Atsadi listened in silence, the corners of his mouth curving with a hint of amusement. When the cabin stood firm again, they planted corn in the thawed soil, their fingers deep in the earth. The smell of it filled her chest, damp and clean. Each seed they pressed down felt like a small prayer. Inside, the fire still burned each night, softer now, less for survival and more for comfort. Above the doorway hung the woven charm of cedar twigs, its red thread faded but strong. It swayed gently when the wind came through the cracks, a reminder of the night she had woken from her ghosts and found something worth keeping. The days grew longer, the air warm enough to carry birdsong through the pines. Sometimes she caught herself standing at the river's edge, watching the current glint like glass. She thought of the woman she had been when he found her, hollow-eyed and ready to vanish, and she barely recognized her. The hunger that had once gnawed her soul was gone, replaced by something quieter, steadier. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose, they sat by the door, sharing the last of the day's warmth. The air smelled of pine and wet soil. Atsadi's hair caught the light, dark and soft, and without thinking she reached out, her fingers slipping gently through it. He turned his head, curious but unstartled. "You gave me back my life," she whispered, her voice low and sure. For a heartbeat he didn't answer, then a faint smile curved his lips. "You just remembered it was yours," he said. The light faded slow, the river murmuring below, the cornfield waiting to grow. They stayed that way, shoulder to shoulder, watching the last fire of the sun sink into the mountains. Two souls once lost to winter, now warmed by a fire they had built together. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.